This is, I think, a wonderful example of how the social sciences get to change when you start instrumenting things. And of course, this happened right up, this was done with an understanding of social network theory, but it was done with data that kind of predated the ability to take a look at things real time. Of course, these days, we can instrument practically anything, and as Asaf has pointed out here with the lab, one could instrument trash, and this is the experiment that puts tags on trash and follows it around. In this case, this plastic container of soap took a very long trip before it ended up resting, and it kind of raises 2 points. One, it does prove you could track anything, and secondly, can you in fact change people's behavior if you start watching all of this stuff, and can it lead to feedback loops? It made me realize that I used to think that social networking was about people, and I got that all wrong. In fact, I tweeted the other day that our cabs are trash, and our phones will soon have more to say than we ever will. It's about time. They clearly know more than we do. And this got me to thinking, this whole new field really doesn't have a name yet. You know, IBM does a great job in a new market of defining something. They did it with e-business, and they're doing it with the branding of smart cities. But we have so many ways of talking about this that I thought we should pause for a moment and think of all the ways that we're describing this new field that doesn't quite have a name and feels like it's coming out of science fiction. Just a few of the ways that we are talking about something that's emerging. There are portions of this that are really doing a remarkable job of building a feedback loop to help us manage things better. One of the more interesting groups out there is a group called Social Compact that looks for aggregate data from a number of sources to actually help banks in the middle of the financial crisis and to help cities. John Talmadge is their founder, and he talks about how they can get multiple forms of data to actually find missing populations and help economies. And here he's talking about a project that they've been working on this year.
What we've done is tried to develop a competency in mining alternative data sources in order to find our own understandings of urban behavior and urban development. And those can range from, you know, sort of traditional data sources such as building permit data or tax assessor data, but it can also look at new forms of data such as how much water is being consumed in a household to calculate household size, or how much soft drink consumption is being consumed, or garbage output from a household. And so by mining these different data sources, and we look at 30 to 50 data sources per community, we're able to understand what the full population count of that community may be. In places like Miami, Florida, we find 90% more people in African American communities in the census captures. So yeah, it's 2 to 1.
So this points out that as we start being able to sense things, there are whole parts of our society that we kind of missed understanding or made assumptions about. This is another one that I found interesting. Here they started looking at the informal economy, the cash economy that isn't reported because it's not part of anything. And on the left, you can see the stuff on the red is in Detroit, where they found the informal economy. So this is cash-based and barter-based transactions and people who are working but not on the records. And on the right, you see an inverse relationship, that wherever there's an informal economy going on, you actually don't have foreclosures going on. So the bank was kind of taking a monolithic view of what the economic data was and making economic decisions based on that. And by going in and looking at something that normally is not picked up, they had an entire different view about where and proof of where foreclosures were happening. And interestingly enough, their initial assumption was that the informal economy was about immigrants, but they found it in St. Louis, they found it in Louisville, and they started realizing that in lower economic times, there's a whole separate cash economy that is very, in fact, strong economically, and you can make decisions based on it if but that you could look at it. And there have been several examples of this that all had to do with instrumenting and finding things out. You know, a classic case is on 2nd Avenue in New York. You could look at where the cars are going, but if you look at the cell phone data, you get a much better sense of where you might want to put a retail service. In Detroit, they found that that when they started looking at retail shops or at grocery stores, that they were doing 3 or 4 times the national average of sales per square foot, showing there was actually a real potential to invest more there than had been before. They saw an instance where, based on water data, they saw 32 people who were living in one household, and that had to do with sharing it, and they were able to make projections based on that. And a very interesting project they're doing is in Johannesburg, where it turns out that the census is at least 80% wrong. There's just not good data. A lot of government services are delivered by post offices, and they wanted to have one post office per 10,000 in population. And the only way to get a sense for who was where was to actually look at cell phone data. And then they could also use that for elasticity to understand how far would people go for a service. So all of this kind of development economic stuff coming directly out of being able to sense things. They've worked very closely with Citibank on a lot of this stuff and have kind of been at the leading edge of many of these things. This is some work that they're doing where they actually get parcel data on values of homes that are either in foreclosure, and because they're actually able to look at the street level, they can answer a question if someone's trying to get a mortgage changed, looking at it not just from an individual's ability to pay, but is it a good decision for the community, information that wasn't available before. One of the things it raises are huge privacy issues and almost an imbalance because companies have access to the kind of data that communities don't.
What happens inevitably in this conversation is that the private sector goes with the proprietary data, and they have better data. The public sector, especially community development, tends to go with the public data, so it's less accurate data. And so you constantly have this information asymmetry that you have to deal with to try to bridge those two.
This raises, the privacy issues are kind of like the elephant in the room in all of us, and also our notion of how privacy is changing. Here's the co-founder of that application that lets you tag graffiti and find parts of the report stuff in the city, and I asked him, how are you dealing with the privacy implications of individuals who are reporting the city, who can be resolved and people can find out who they are?
I like to say that privacy is often eroded one convenience at a time, and this is the truth. I mean, we as consumers are very kind of hesitant to give out personal information until we have a justifiably good reason to do so. And oftentimes they come in little convenient packages, and we just kind of buy into them, and over time that erodes. But when it comes to an application like this, and we are collecting kind of the benefit we have is we're collecting largely environmental data. Yes, there's an individual reporter. Yes, we're tying that to an individual reporter, which can open up a weird door. But I think that the user has largely, a user of our application has largely kind of, they are a hand raiser. And so they don't mind necessarily saying, hi, I would like this, I would like this street light fixed, or I would like this graffiti painted over.
One of the great points when he talks about a hand raiser, one of the things I've noticed in the social media world is we've had it easy in the sense that if you're blogging or you're putting up something on Facebook, you're kind of an exhibitionist. You're like out there telling someone something. But as you start moving towards ambient data, you're not necessarily expecting that you're sharing with people. It's one thing if Facebook tells you a friend like you likes a restaurant like that. If AT&T tells it to you, you have a different brand reaction.